Hello friends, welcome to CEC Live Lectures. Dear friends, with our ongoing series on Indian writing in English. Today we are going to talk on one of the important topics. We have discussed how Indian writing in English translation emerged as the important topic of discussion in our previous sessions too, and you have gathered maximum knowledge through the sessions, we believe. And friends, today we are going to talk on the implications of the translated literature, and for the discussion on the topic we have with us in our studios Professor Anand Prakash. Professor Anand Prakash is a retired professor of English, and he has taught for several years in the Delhi University as well. Through the live platform of CEC, he delivers the lectures which are beneficial for you, as we always get your comments as well as your feedbacks through our mail. So dear friends, let's welcome our guest Professor Anand Prakash, and let's try to understand the implications of translated literature. Hello sir, welcome to the lecture.
Thanks, Geetika, and welcome viewers. This is one of the last lectures on this series, and this will relate to the central idea of the series, and that is that we should make available for the benefit of readers in India and elsewhere the English translations of Indian writing. And Indian writing was vast. It covers a whole millennium and more, in fact 2 millennia, and there is a great deal of versatility and variety in the Indian writing. So I hope that that has been to some extent captured through these lectures, which base themselves on the assumption that the literature is available today also in English translation. As I went over the lectures in my mind, and as I discussed with fellow participants, fellow lecturers in this series, I realized that one could also go into the reasons why English translation is necessary for us, what role it plays, how through English we can reach a bigger audience, or how certain difficulties also might arise in the course of our discussion. So translation itself as an activity through which literature can be made available became a subject of interest for me and for my fellow scholars here. So we thought that we could go into this aspect, and this will raise a large number of questions as to why translation into English, and what difficulties are created, and whether in translation certain aspects of original writing become somewhat blurred, somewhat vague, or they could also be overemphasized through what we select and what we do not select. So all these things are there. So let's go into the theoretical as well as other implications of the translation activity with respect to Indian writing. I'll, in the beginning of the discussion, raise certain questions regarding the function of translation in today's world, because that is why we are making available a discussion on Indian writing in English translation through lectures which also have their medium as English. So the first question that I raise for myself, and you can also ponder over it, is the nature of the translation activity. The question is translation a bridge between one person and another? There is a kind of a ditch, there is a kind of a hollow space between two people, and that hollow space is supposed to be joined with the help of a bridge, so that one can move from one's own place to the other one to talk and then get back, or the other person has also a chance through this bridge to come here this side and talk to the person present here. So is translation a bridge? Is the metaphor of bridge to do justice with the nature of translation? This question you can think of. Straight answer may not be given either by me or by you, but you keep in mind that literature could be considered as using a bridge called the translation in order to reach a larger audience. Then the answer is partly assumed in the second question that I raised, and that question is, does it, that is the translation, join cultures, societies, countries? Through translation, I can understand what the person from the neighboring country means. I can ask my translator translator who will help me to translate somebody else's language through which I come in contact with that person's culture, because that person has grown in a different environment than my own, and we think of many issues that are raised in culture through our own specs, through our own eyes, through our own visions. Then if that is so, if translation joins cultures, if it joins societies, brings them nearer each other, if it brings countries also into contact with one another, I think it's a very healthy activity. It's an activity that will create conditions in which human beings can, with cordiality, relate with one another and can hold an opinion which is acceptable to both. The third question, does it enable people to walk in and out of territory? I'm using the word walk in and walk out, which means that there is something called liberation here. One can liberate oneself from one's own culture and walk to another place. And I'm using it as a metaphor, not that one is geographically crossing, but one is crossing mentally the boundaries that are there in front of us. So we cross those boundaries, we walk out of those boundaries into other boundaries, and into other areas, other limited areas, and translation helps us there. So through translation, we can have a kind of traveling, a kind of journey that happens, in order to reach other cultures. And this offering of the journey is available to even the other people who can come to me using translation and then talk to me. So it's a kind of a mental journey that happens through translation. Is that the case? This metaphor is there. So think about the metaphor was the bridge. Now the metaphor is the mental space that is created through translation, which can then be covered, and one can go over to the other side, and then interact with people unknown and unheard of. Although all these are mixed, of course, but I have separated these aspects. You have not heard of a person. You don't know who that person is, what principles, norms of life he or she follows. I don't know, and I could not imagine unless I saw that person. But translation is one activity where the unseen and the unknown, when the person who is unheard of, I may not have heard of certain tribals even in India, and therefore when I see some translated literature, then I know that, oh, these people exist. And maybe, who knows, even these people after translation would see that a person like me also existed. So it's mutual, it works both ways, and translation that way is a medium through which people come from different walks of life, different regions, different cultures, different territories, different political opinions that cover them, that surround them. Therefore, the first question actually has the answer built into it, and that answer is that humanity, the world, is potentially unified, and translation actually makes this potentiality into a reality. So really we become one through translation. You start translating other literatures into your language and allow other languages to translate your literature into theirs. The world has become one and unified. So this seems to be the larger big purpose of translation, and one wonders whether through the series that we have run we would have been able to make available certain ideas that were originated in India for the benefit of others, for the discussion of others, and whether some kind of a healthy dialogue began in a small way so far as we are concerned. Then I answer it a bit directly, and I say, if that were the case, if all the questions and answers that I presented, if they were true, if that were the case, it will enrich humans in terms of widening the mental horizon. At the moment I am sitting in a room. After some time I will go out and look at the trees which surround, and I can't see beyond the trees. This is the physical part, but the mind also has a horizon, and that horizon is of ideas. I have a certain set of ideas, and those ideas guide me. And when they guide me, in a way, they are also restricting me. So that is my horizon, the mental horizon, which comprises ideas and values. Now, when translation happens, and I know about other things which I didn't know. So my mind is widened. I'm more tolerant now regarding other opinions, other perspectives, other emphases, and then because my mental horizon is widened, then I can think of different things in a different manner, in the sense, that I will see, maybe my view was limited, and now I have gained quite a bit from the experiences that were enshrined in the literature of other people and languages. So mental horizon is widened with the help of translation. Examples are many. I didn't know when I was a young man that there existed a very great fiction in Russian writing, and then somebody told me that Russian writing is absolutely great, particularly of the 19th century. And I had heard in my own language the names of Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, etc. But then how to read Russian writing? And then, there were channels available, English translations of Russian literature and even Hindi translations of Russian literature available, and I could see what Tolstoy had to say, what Dostoevsky had to emphasize, what lessons they had to give, and whether I knew about those lessons and about those experiences on my own. So I started wondering. So in that sense, mental horizon is widened this way. And then, the second part, and take in not just bits of new information. Information comes through translation. If I'm reading a Russian text, then I know about Russian life, about Russian culture, and about Russian developments in politics and in ideology. I know about that, but that I call bits of information. Some information here, some information elsewhere. There is a name of a place, there is a name of an institution, there is a name of a language. So these are called information. So after reading Russian literature, I know about these in this or that part in a small measure. So mental horizon is widened with respect to the information that comes through translation. Okay, but then also I say perspectives requiring courage to hold. First, perspectives. What is a perspective? Perspective is a kind of an angle from which things are seen. The angle could be higher, the angle could be lower, the angle could be from the left side, the angle could be from the right side, and from every angle the same object looks different. That is called perspective. So if I am looking at it from my angle, then that's my perspective, but somebody sitting in front of me or on my sides would have seen the same thing in a different manner. So I should know that also. Maybe what I see is only one side and a smaller side, and what other person thinks is another side and a bigger side. So that perspective is something that is very important in the case of literature. So you read a poem and certain things are eulogized there, shown as good, shown as superior and praised, and I never thought they were praiseworthy. So what do? There is a clash of perspectives. I thought they were wrong and somebody else tells me that they are right. So there are two perspectives on the same thing. So then I start wondering whether I am right or that other person is right. So this way there is a clash of perspectives, and at least I know that now even if I am right, somebody else has a different opinion. So this coexistence of perspectives, the two people can sit together even with difference of opinion. That is called a perspective. So when you read literature, when I read literature in translation of a country where I have not been, the languages of which I do not know, then I realize through translation that a different way of looking at things, an angle which is new, an angle that is unknown exists, and therefore that should be taken into account. So mental horizon in that case is widened in two ways. I repeat, one, that it gives us information about another culture, another country, another society, and two, that it also tells us about a different perspective, which means a way of looking at things. So I have my way, you have your way, and when two of us meet, then our different ways, they come together, and then I know that my horizon is that way much better to adopt and accept. Then I said in this particular sentence, requiring courage to hold. Courage to hold. Is there a perspective that requires courage to hold? You say it, and then you have problems. Maybe there is a big group in society which does not have the same opinion, does not have the same perspective, and I know that if they come to know that I differ with them, then they will feel uneasy, and an uneasy surrounding is a surrounding that terrifies, that makes me afraid. In that case, I require courage to tell other people that this is what I feel to be the right thing. So, literature, instills that kind of moral and intellectual courage also. Because if I know that there is an opinion and I don't agree with that opinion, then I can say from my side that this is what I hold, and since I have read literature saying the same thing or saying something different, therefore, there is a kind of sense of tolerance increased in me, and I believe that sense of tolerance also gives me a kind of courage. So, courage is important. It is very different to see a thing, and it is much more of a quality when I not only see it but say it, that this is what I have seen. So, that is what I mean by having the courage to hold. Would that be enabling humans to take steps towards closer ties and exciting equations? It can happen, it may not happen. If I like an opinion, I can I can accept it, I can adopt it. But then that adoption will bring me closer to that person, will increase my understanding and will increase the other person's understanding. And the equation with the other person through translation is going to be of an exciting nature. Maybe I have lived in a country for 40 years, 50 years, and every day the same thing was repeated, and I heard nothing new. But then I met a person who came from elsewhere, and this person had a different opinion. So I sat with him, sat with her, and then started talking. And when one started talking, then the kind of friendship was created, and that friendship is the equation. So imagine that two unknown people become friends, they become good neighbors, they become sweet company to each other, and this happens at the level of translation also. So you know that so far as the first point is concerned, translation is useful, it is healthy, it's widening the scope of thinking, and at the same time it makes one and the other person a better human being. So this is what we thought was the purpose of making available discussion about Indian writing that is available earlier in English translation. The second point that I want to raise here is with respect to India, because we are talking about Indian writing. So against this theory, in the background of this theory, what do we say about conditions in India so that are relevant to our subject here? So the second point is regarding the Indian conditions in our world. In India, in the 19th century, translation in the hands of the colonizing force became a project and enterprise. Colonizing force in the 19th century. All of us know that East India Company was here, and they were not merely doing business, they were also tampering, they were also meddling in the affairs of our country at the level of culture and politics. And at that point of time, we saw that they started translating our works into English, and it became a kind of a project for them in the 19th century. Why did they do it? Why did the Englishmen in the latter half of the 18th century and the first half of the 19th century started translating Indian literature into English? Today we can ask this question, and ask not just bluntly, but also in a manner that will tell us as to what the logic was. My answer to this question is that they wanted to understand India better so that they could rule it better. Rule it in the right sense and in the wrong sense. In the right sense, because then they would be more sympathetic towards us, they would be more courteous, they would know how they can make themselves likeable to us, even though they are masters and we are sort of slaves. So this would be the purpose of the good people among the Englishmen, that before they started ruling us, or in the course of their rule here, they wanted to know whom they were ruling, what kind of literature was created here earlier, what kind of a culture existed in India at that point of time. So that inspired them to take on the project of translating Indian writing into English. And it was confined mainly to the ancient writing, not just Indian writing, but Indian ancient writing. So they would be getting translated our scriptures, the old texts, the Sanskrit texts, for instance, theory texts, literature, poetry, drama, that would be translated into English in the 19th century. and this became a project for them. They did it under a plan, and the plan was to understand India better. The other thing is that they also were planning in order to see that Indian writing was available in English, and therefore people should read English to enjoy Indian writing. Another way of learning Indian writing would have been for them to learn Indian languages and then read Indian literature. They didn't choose that option. That option would have been difficult. Therefore, they thought that the language will be theirs, some scholars will translate, and then they will read Indian writing in English. So there is a problem here. The problem, if you want to read Indian writing, read it in the Indian languages. The other is you don't have the time or the inclination or the facility to have it in the original language. Therefore, the easy option is to get it translated into English and then read it. So it cuts both ways. So in the 19th century, a kind of project occurred under which Indian classical texts in particular were sought to be translated into English. So particularly classics from the ancient period were rendered into English and other European languages, because in the 19th century Europe had scholars not confined to England but also to other countries, and there were some countries in Europe which were vying with one another. Actually in India also, in the 18th century particularly, there were 4 or 5 kinds of people and languages and cultures were available. Portuguese were here, French were here, Germans were here, and of course English were there. So these people would all be here for certain kind of control, certain kind of business, their own languages, and these people remained till the 19th century. And then the translation that was done in English could also be done into German and vice versa. So anyway, in the 19th century, translation happened on this scale that Indian writing became available in a number of European languages at that time. And the Orientalist venture. What is Orientalist venture? India is a country in the Eastern world. Eastern world is called Oriental world, and the person from the West calls this the Oriental world. So they call Orientalist writing, Orientalist experience, and for themselves, to themselves, one another, they would say, oh, those Orients. So imagine I sitting here in Europe, talking to another person in Europe, I say, those Orients, the Orientals there. What does this those mean? Are we not human beings and also close to them? But no, because they are sitting at a distance and they are calling themselves us. And others sitting in India as there, so a kind of a cleavage, a kind of a difference is created between one side of the world and the other side. So these Orientalists were there. The other word for the opposite of Oriental is Occident. So Occidentalists were telling Orientals that they are interested in their activity. So this Orientalist venture, in which texts written, composed in the Eastern world had to be translated into Western world and in the language of the Western world, and there they were made available. So this and finally to the Western world, and the availability was possible then of the wisdom of the East, so to say. So Orientalists paid some respect and homage to the value of writing in India, and therefore they also called it wisdom. So that way in the 19th century this kind of a venture began. The other point that I take up will be elaborated in detail in the second part of the lecture, but let me introduce it in a short time. This trend continued in tandem with the speed of English in India, spread of English in India. You see, this was happening at the same time English institutions were established in the 19th century. Schools were opened, colleges were opened, and these colleges started giving education in English. And since the number of schools was increasing, the schools were multiplying, therefore English also became a presence in the Indian conditions. Now this created a different complication, and when we go further into the discussion, then we can discuss it briefly, so that in the final part of our discussion, the second part, we are able to take up these questions in a critical sense. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving us this productive session. Friends, you're requested to be with us as we are back after a short break and would be discussing on the other elements of the topic too. Till then, keep watching us. Thank you. Hello friends, welcome back to this session. Friends, today we are talking on the implications of translated literature, and for the discussion on the topic we have with us in our studios Professor Anand Prakash. Professor Anand Prakash is a retired professor of English, and through his knowledge we always enlightened ourselves. So friends, let's welcome our guest Professor Anand Prakash once again, and let's try to grab maximum knowledge through him. Hello sir, welcome to the lecture.
Thanks and welcome friends. We are now going into the second part of the discussion, and here we will take up questions that relate to the immediate context and environment in our midst. And for instance, I said that the theoretical aspect was important to understand the nature of translation. Now once that is done, now think of the problems and the trends that occur in the course of translating and making available such literature to the larger audience. I say that in the 19th century, English started spreading its influence, and that happened at the level of the government, at the level of planners, at the level of heads, that were active at a higher level than the ordinary masses. So schools and colleges were opening, textbooks were being planned, scholars were taking more and more interest in English, and there were Indians also who started learning English in order to communicate through this language with their masters and with one another. And you know that when a different language is inculcated like this with state patronage, Englishmen are supporting it, Englishmen are investing money in it. That money is collected from here. It is also taken sometimes when the help is required from the original country, that is England, and then these institutions and this working of the money from above, from the government, this also creates conditions in which a language prospers. So English in the 19th century becomes a language of the masters. It becomes at the same time the language of the higher sections in Indian society. That person who knows English can wield better power in culture, in atmosphere. You could talk in English in the 19th century and everybody would think that you are not just Indian, you are much superior, much higher placed. What am I saying? What am I implying? The question that I want to raise in this context is that since conditions are changing, people are adopting not just policies of a country other than ours, they are also adopting their ways of thinking, their style of work, because now their language is our language to a large extent. So we see that in our country, suppose there are 30 crore people at that time in India, out of those 30 crores, at least 50,000 or a lakh would be understanding English, would be talking in English. So this 50,000 or 1 lakh at that time will become 2 lakhs later, 10 lakhs still later. And this group is going to be a powerful group. For the sake of argument, let me call this group middle class. They are neither masters nor they are slaves in that sense, who use only their own native languages. They are people somewhere in the middle. So let's call them middle class. And this middle class thrives not by any kind of activity on the land or activity in industry. They thrive on the basis of, let's say, the middle level work like education, like writing, like bringing out newspapers, like being lawyers, being in the court, in government service. And this section keeps increasing in the country in the 19th century. I call this the middle class country. And because this middle class is gradually more and more conducting its business through English. Earlier it was Persian or Urdu. Now this work is shifted from Persian and Urdu to English. Therefore, a kind of presence of English-speaking people can be seen in all parts of the country. If you are talking in English in the 19th century, then you can easily communicate with a person from the South India. The person in the eastern part of the country, let's say Bengal, that can easily communicate with a person from Lahore, because both of them now are speaking not either Urdu on one side and Bangla on the other, but a language called English. So English, becomes a kind of unifying factor at the level of the middle class. I'm not saying at the lower level. The peasants will never understand English. The worker in the factory will not understand English. The ordinary masses walking on the street in small towns, villages, will not understand English. I'm not talking about them. But a group is created in India in the 19th century comprising middle class. And this group cuts across different regions. And this group is unified. So through this group, you can approach the larger masses in each region. So this is the role that English is playing at that time. I'm talking in general, but now let me be specific. This group now reads English literature. They also write in English. And if they write in Indian languages, then they also can translate that Indian writing into English. So this new kind of development is taking place in the 19th century in a manner that so far as English is concerned becomes finally unificatory. It starts unifying. And you can say that the purpose of introducing English here was to stabilize the Britishers here in a superior position. But the opposite was happening, that the country was getting united through English. And if the middle class is united, and after the middle class, the lower classes also get united through English, then initially they will all be accepting whatever is given to them by the English authorities. But because they would be united, and if there is a crisis sometime, if there are difficulties in life sometimes, then because they are in touch with one another, they can also talk about their problems. And if those problems are created by the rich, by the powerful, by the mighty, by the ruling class, or by the Britishers, then those problems will also reflect upon the weakness of and the problems of the upper class. So if anger is created in the lower classes, that anger gets shared at the national level through the middle class. So this is the kind of thing that occurs in India in the 19th century, as a result of which, within 50 years of 1857, when the first war of independence happened, within 50 years of that, there will be a strong party in India called the Indian National Congress emerging as a major voice of protest in India. And when I say India, so India in fact in the meantime has been created. Earlier it was different parts, different regions, but through English, through this unificatory middle class in India, towards the end of the 19th century, there is a kind of thing called the country, called India, and therefore India has started becoming one independent, unified, integrated entity. So just see, you intend one thing and the opposite happens. Yes, in English and its stranglehold has increased, but through English the country also stands unified. So if they think, they will think now in a united manner. The anger of the person from South India, the anger of the person from the North India, the anger of the person from West Bengal or the eastern part of India or the western India, that anger will unite them. And if the anger is united, then it's a national phenomena, and very soon there will be clouds of the national movement hovering over the minds and the hearts of the ruling class. This is how one can explain the rise of the nationalist consciousness in India in the 19th century. So I say this trend continued in tandem with the spread of English in India, the trend of translation. As a result, both colonizer and colonized benefited. I've also said how colonizer was benefited, but in the second part of my point that I made, I also indicated that in some respects, even the lower masses were benefited. At the level of the growing middle class, English became the means of bringing together different regional literatures, and it proved to be a unifying factor. Regional literatures, Punjabi literature, Marathi literature, Gujarati literature, Tamil literature, Malayalam literature, all these literatures through English became available to the middle class all over the country. And if I know how a novelist is responding to his or her conditions in Tamil, in Malayalam, in Kannada, and then I'll be matching my understanding of the reality here with their understanding of the reality there. So that way also the country is getting closer to, the different parts of the country are getting closer to one another in a more significant manner. Then the third point, beginning in the 19th century, the era of translated literature had two initial phases. Let's say that translated literature now is a big body, is a big chunk. A large number of books now are available in English translation, and the translations have been done from Indian languages, the writing that has occurred there. And there are two initial phases. Initially what happens? Let's go into it. The first belong to ancient writing from India being translated into English. This I have indicated earlier. But then in the 19th century, English is doing a kind of justice to Indian writing by translating it and making it available here as well as in the world. This point I already made, so I would not repeat here. So the first belong to ancient India, writing from India, being translated into English, and the second, and this is important, doing the opposite. This second was the need of Indian national movement, which also I have indicated, that began in earnest towards the end of the century. National movement in India would require its people who know English to tell the constituents of the national movement what is happening in Germany, what is happening in France, what is happening in England, what kind of writing is available in England. So Hindi writing, Gujarati writing, that writing will now require some kind of a strengthening from England, some kind of a strengthening from Germany, some kind of a strengthening from France. Now, isn't it, viewers, interesting that even though we are being ruled by Englishmen in the 19th century, we are reading their literature also in our languages, and it implies lots of things, because their writing there is not the kind of writing that is supported by their behavior here. English writing in the 19th century is the writing of protest, is the writing of rejection. There are romantic poets in the 19th century in England. There is Wordsworth, there is Coleridge, there is Keats, there is Byron, there is Shelley. All these writers are critical of their own society. They call their own society sick. They call their society suffocating. So isn't it significant that even as we think they are lords, their own people, their own poets there in their own country are telling them that you are suffocating, you are bad, you are not natural, and you have become self-seeking. If I hear from the romantic poets this view about Englishmen, then I'll be very happy here, because I as a slave, I as an oppressed person, I feel bad here, and somebody is calling my enemy bad, so I'll be definitely happy. So I'd like to sometimes take help from the critic of my enemy in his own country. This is what is happening through English. That's why in the 19th century the translation went into the other side. English was used as the translating language, but what was translated was not Indian writing but also English writing into Hindi, into Gujarati. So this kind of movement to and fro occurred, and Indian writer would like to know what is being written there, and maybe somebody knows in England, somebody knows in France that their writings are being translated by Indians for their own languages, so they would be interested in knowing our literature. So who knows, maybe they would send now translators to India to read Indian languages and read Indian literatures and translate them there. I am now talking in the second phase not of the Indian classical writing, I am talking of the contemporary writing that is done in the 19th century itself. Romantic poetry written in the 19th century, and romantic poets now wanting to know what's happening in India. That's why initially in the 1850s and more, one saw some people writing who were Indians writing in English, and that became very effective at that time. And later on, Indian writing would be available to them, but their writing would be available to us here. And if we have interest in German, then through English translation of the German classics, we can be benefited here. This is the second phase, and the second phase makes things really problematic, really complex, and it will go a long way. From the early 20th century to the middle of the 20th century is hardly 50 years. And in those 50 years, the world is going to change so far as India is concerned. That is what India wanted. They wanted to get free from the enslavement by the British in those 50-60 years. So beginning in the 19th century, the era of translated literature had two initial phases. The first belonged to ancient writing, and the second doing the opposite. The second was the need of Indian national movement. Indian national movement wanted more and more writing from other places to be translated into Hindi, into Gujarati, because that way our movement would be strengthened, because we would be learning then in our own language about the strengths of other literatures. I can give you one example. Till the last part of the 19th century, there is not any fiction of the kind that existed in France and England and Russia. It was not there. The first novel in Indian languages would appear sometime in 1880, whereas the novel had appeared in Europe in the 18th century itself. And in 1740, 1750, they had started writing novels in prose. So what happens is that when you read other literatures in English or in English translation, now German literature is available in India in the 19th century in English translation, and English literature is available here in Gujarati translation. So therefore you see that the translation activity either into English or from English into other languages, this increases so much that it's not merely getting together of human beings, it's also a learning experience for us, and we are getting more and more educated in the political sense of the term. So a national movement, which is a political movement, that movement starts using translation of literature as a big tool to understand and change their reality. So the second was the need of Indian national movement that began in earnest towards the end of the century. I said that the Indian National Congress had come into being in the penultimate decade in the 1880s. It had emerged as a strong party, and it continued till 1940s uninterrupted. This, translation in the reverse, this was there, and this would have definitely helped us, understand our problems better through translated literature. I don't want to go into the Indian national movement and its impact on translation, because that is connected with us only tangentially, only on the sides. I am interested at the moment to talk only about translation of Indian writings into English, and for that purpose I am not spending much time on the period 1900 to 1947, 1950, and straight away I am coming to 1950, when English is has an option. It doesn't have a kind of compulsion now, but then English starts being used as some kind of a vehicle of translation for us. Now, before I begin this particular point, let me explain a general term to you, and that term is quite popular these days, but even 20 years ago this would have been unthinkable. What is that word? What is that term? That term is linguistic imperialism. We have heard of economic imperialism. We can also hear this word political imperialism, that there are some countries very strong, it has a large number of countries under its influence, and therefore it's a kind of empire, and empire and imperialism, these are two related things. How is it possible that there can be linguistic imperialism? Think about it. Can imperialism set its foot in the form of language? This is the question I am posing, and there is no theoretical answer needed here. Let's look at the reality around us. In India, in the free India, in the India after partition, in India that starts its innings as a liberated country in 1947, 1950, the number of English schools has increased. This is a serious phenomenon. The number of schools in India till the 1947 was not very big, but now in a small town also you can see English being taught as a language of not merely as a language, but even as a means of communication in science, in arts, in philosophy, in social sciences, in everywhere you find that English is the medium. Why? Is not English now spreading its tentacles? It's controlling threads all over India in order to replace Indian languages, and becoming a powerful weapon in the hands of people who are not themselves there physically, but whose policies are being pursued now through the adoption of English by the Indians themselves. I call it linguistic imperialism. The imperialists are not here, they have left us. Britishers left us in 1947, but then their language came here, and it is this language which has started suppressing us through our minds. Most of us now talk in favor of English, and we argue in favor of English, and if somebody criticizes English, then we take cudgels in our hands and support the English cause. There are, in India there can be seen, and one can refer to them, called language riots, and they are in favor of English most of the time. This is the cultural side. There is economic side also. The number of books that are sold today in India, one should compare the number of books being sold in India, the dictionaries, the science books, the others, and the money that is being funneled from India into the Western centers. All this is, I think, through language, and it's a kind of linguistic imperialism. But before that, let me also point out that in 1947 and onwards, what has happened is that the command center of Indian writing has changed. The command center of Indian writing earlier was the national movement. We were writing for India. We had produced a Tagore, we had produced a Sarat Chandra, we had produced a Subramanya Bharati, we had produced a Premchand. And all these writers were talking about India because India needed them. In 1950, what happens is that the command center has changed. Now there are schools and colleges, they have to frame syllabi, and there's not much of research being done here. So they straight away borrow research from elsewhere. And through the way of research, what happens is their language also comes, their books also come. And when their books in their language come, then they have more supporters here. So the command center is now changed. The command center is now Europe, it is not India. And because the command center is Europe, therefore, even in our literature also, we have now ideas coming from there, values coming from there, attitudes coming from there. Our novels in different languages are being written on the lines that are suggested by people who write in English, who write in France, who French, who write in German. So command center of Indian writing has changed in the 1950s. It happened in Cold War period. This is another word that I want to explain. What is a Cold War? Cold War is that war where things are being spread through influences that are invisible. War is very visible. So somebody comes and attacks. So somebody sends a war plane and everybody knows what is happening. But when the attack doesn't happen directly on the surface, when the attack is happening from behind the scene, you don't even know where the attack is coming from. That is called the Cold War. So hot war came to an end in 1945, but the Cold War started, the war of ideas. I can give you one example in literature, because we are talking about Indian writing in English, Indian writing in English translation. A large number of writers in Indian languages in the 1950s and 60s started arguing in favor of experience, not in favor of reality, not in favor of politics and ideology, not in favor of equality and liberty. They started talking in terms of art, started in terms of experience. So don't talk about ideas, because ideas will take you to the side of changing the wrong things. But if you talk about experience, then you will say, I am wrong and this is my experience. So people should talk about their experience of being wrong, but not the reality of their being wrong, so that they can put them right. This is what I call Cold War. So the emphasis in the 1950s and 60s in all languages in India, perhaps without exception, are of the experience kind. They talk about experience, they talk about feelings, they talk about self-pity. Most of the writing is about self-pity. I am so bad, and I am so lonely, I don't have a way. This is the kind of writing that is being done in India in the immediately after freedom is attained. So we don't believe in now talking about the wrong effects of policies. We talk about the effect of policies and the experience that the effect generates. This is what I call Cold War. This is where the command center is once again from the world outside. So this is one point, and this comes through English now, through English translation. And the worst thing that has happened, and even as one of the runners of this course, let me make this point quite emphatically at my level, that translation now is available of all the important Indian writings in English translation. What has it done? It has, I think, killed the study of Indian writing in Indian languages. Now, one can see, that of course I cannot directly refer to one or two things because the number is not clear in my mind, but the Hindi department, the Gujarati department, the Bangla department, the Punjabi department in India is not today as strong as it would have been even 30, 40 years ago. Why? Because all these literatures are now available in English translation. So which means that Indian languages are being taught now. Indian literature is being taught now in the foreign universities. A large number of people have gone away from India to teach Hindi in American universities. So Hindi literature research is happening in America in the medium of English. So this is the kind of fallback, the fallout that has happened, and we have to take a look at it. The final question that I raise, and here I conclude, is where do we go from here? I think the first thing is to understand the process as to what is happening actually. If this is happening, then we can take corrective measures. And what is the corrective measure? The corrective measure is that we will remain on equal terms with the writings which are being translated. So we will get back to at least one thing. Okay, we read our literature in English translation, but we will read others' literature in Hindi translation or Gujarati translation, as we did in the time of the national movement. And the give and take between different languages has to be on the level of equality. So we will discuss English literature in Hindi and Gujarati, and we'll discuss Gujarati literature in English. And that way, we will have scholars from both the sides, from both the places, and these scholars will freely and courageously talk about one and other's literatures, and there will be a kind of equilibrium, a kind of opportunity for all of us to discuss at the level of equality, and that I think is going to help us grow still further and make a world in which all of us constituents are equal parts. Thank you.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving us this session on implications of translated literature. Dear friends, we are taking your leave today, but we are promising that we will be coming tomorrow and would be discussing on another topic. Friends, we are on the verge of completing this series on Indian writing in English translation. If you feel so that you have certain topics concerning to the series which you like to be conducted here through the live session, then do write to us at info.cec@nic.in. We'll try to conduct sessions on those topics. So friends, keep watching us, keep writing us. We will be meeting again very soon. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, sir. Thank you so very much.